According to the Brookings Institution, the data proves that democracies are less likely to spawn internal armed conflicts or experience deadly terrorism, because they channel dissent through nonviolent means and manage violence through respect for the rule of law. By comparing examples of anti-state violence in democracies such as the United Kingdom, India, and Iraq with similar terrorist or insurgent action in authoritarian states such as Syria, Myanmar, and Yugoslavia, I aim to discover whether or not the incidence of terrorism and violent insurgencies is actually lower in democratic societies. First of all, take the case of the United Kingdom. The UK has been regarded as a very robust democracy. It is ranked number 16 worldwide and as a full democracy in the Democracy Index. And yet, the United Kingdom still dealt with an Irish insurgency in the form of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or IRA. This conflict was known as the Troubles. But what flaws in the British system allowed for the proliferation of terrorist and insurgent behavior, even in a democracy that should, according to the Brookings Institute, allow for dissent through nonviolent means? Well, the Irish people wanted the right to self-governance. The British system technically was structured in a way that allowed for Irish participation via the possibility of Home Rule, where an Irish parliament would legislate under the authority of Westminster. However, this option was permanently postponed due to Irish rejection of the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. But why did they reject participation in democracy? In 1918, Sinn Féin won a landslide victory in the elections due to outrage at the British response during the 1916 Easter Uprising. The violent military suppression by the UK actually inflamed the violent and nationalist elements in Ireland rather than keep them under control. This would lead to 22 counties in Ireland forming the Republic of Ireland under the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. While 6 remained as Northern Ireland, loyal to the UK. The democratic system in Northern Ireland experienced a further degree of failure in the 1960s, as political power had been concentrated within the Protestant majority, effectively silencing the Catholics, who are about 25% of the population. This led to the beginning of the Troubles, as the IRA rose to fight what they saw as undemocratic and unjust rule by the United Kingdom over Northern Ireland and its Catholic minority. What I think is the key to the failure of British democracy in Ireland was the loss of legitimacy. After the British responded with a disproportionate use of force, the Irish would never recognize them as a legitimate government. A more direct failure of democracy regarding terrorism and rebellion can be found in Iraq. After the overthrow of Saddam Hussein by the United States, the USA presided over the transformation of Iraq into a democratic state. After delays at the insistence of the US government, elections were finally held on January 30th, 2005. However, they were plagued by problems such as miscounts, irregularities, and boycotts from citizens. Despite this, the election was certainly an improvement over the utter lack of electoral democracy under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. According to John Feffer of the FPIF, since the U.S. invasion in 2003, anywhere from 50,000 to 700,000 Iraqi civilians have died, many at the hands of U.S. forces, but increasingly from terrorist groups and government death squads. Thousands of more Iraqi soldiers and police have also been killed. Violent crime, including kidnapping, rape, and armed robbery, has grown to record levels. There's been a dramatic proliferation of small arms, and private militias have been growing rapidly. Clearly, democracy was failing again, just like in Britain, to suppress violent terrorism and uprisings. But why? Despite the freedom of elections and the success of the United Iraqi Alliance in raising Iran-backed Ibrahim al-Jafari to the role of Prime Minister, the United States successfully intervened by lobbying for the selection of their favored candidate, Nouri al-Maliki, to become the Prime Minister. He then remained as such until 2014, when he assumed the role of Vice President following that from 2016 to 2018. Unsurprisingly, the nature of American control in all levels of government was quite transparent, including American control of the judiciary, able to block any new laws, American ambassadors holding positions in nearly all government ministries in Iraq, and U.S. control commissions that dictated fiscal and media policy, among other regulatory areas. The backlash of this caused widespread uprisings and mass killings from various dissident groups in Iraq who sought to implement their own authority rather than accept the authority of a foreign country. Despite the weakness of Iraqi democracy compared to the British system, the nature of their violent uprisings are nearly the same. Lack of legitimacy in the eyes of a certain group or groups will cause those groups to rise up as who they see as a foreign oppressor, and this will always cause violence to erupt even when avenues for political expression exist within a democratic system. Now let's look at an authoritarian regime. Take Bashar al-Assad's Syria. Syria, despite having a history of violent extremism and subsequent government repression, was stable until its authoritarian system absolutely failed starting in 2011. Protests against state violence escalated into a civil war in that time due to an enemy-centric counterinsurgency approach. This implicated all protesters and dissidents as targets of the military, and President Assad actually deployed his elite Alawite military units against the broadly Sunni protesters, with an actual manifestation that was closer to indiscriminate annihilation than suppression of a protest. These policies had two short-order effects. The first is that it alienated the population along sectarian lines, and the second actually derives from the first, and that it caused mass defections of Sunni military personnel from his army. In the end, rather than successfully crushing the resistance, the Assad regime awakened decades of simmering conflict, bolstered the opposition, and gave them valuable information and know-how to conduct military actions, and actually prolonged what could have been a short conflict. Here we see that the threat of regime military action against the opposition actually stokes the fires of the conflict just as it did in democratic Britain with Ireland, and can unleash widespread chaos just like what happened in supposedly democratic Iraq. Myanmar, an authoritarian state, also faces uprisings and insurrections. The longest running is the Karen Rebellion. The Karen are an ethnic group who have been marginalized under the Tatmadaw, the military council of Myanmar, and have been waging a war for independence since 1949 under the banner of the KNU, the Karen National Union, and its military wing, the Karen National Liberation Army, or the KNLA for short. Since 1962, the Rohingya Muslims of Rakhine State in Myanmar have been in an on-and-off insurgency against the Tatmadaw as well. Due to persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, the Tatmadaw target the Rohingya and have criticized pro-democracy advocate and de facto leader, or former de facto leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, for not responding quickly to the army's call for a meeting of the National Security and Defense Council, which has the power to enforce a state of emergency in Rakhine State. And yet another ethnic minority, the Kachin, have also demonstrated their displeasure with the Tatmadaw. On May 3rd of 2021, the Kachin Independence Army said it had shot down a military helicopter near the town of Momok in Kachin Province after days of military air raids. Again, the problem lies in the fact that the legitimacy of the Tatmadaw's government does not exist to these minority groups. The Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya do not acknowledge the Bamar-denominated Tatmadaw as their leaders due to their history of persecution and failure to give minority groups a voice in government. Tensions were beginning to ease when Myanmar was transitioning into a democracy under Aung San Suu Kyi beginning in 2010. But after the February 1st coup by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, ethnic tensions have reignited and led to an uptick in anti-state activity. To answer my initial question, it does seem that democracies are less prone to insurgencies and terrorism. However, the root causes for these behaviors are the same as in authoritarian states and failing democracies. The lack of legitimacy of the government is the spark for insurgency and terrorism in both democracies and dictatorships. The majority of these groups act out due to the opportunities theory discussed in class. There seems to be a common factor of a religious or ethno-lingual barrier that creates political distance and disagreement between the regime and the rebels, when their autonomy and way of life is not respected or infringed upon. It is a lesson for all democracies to keep in mind. They are just as susceptible to insurgencies and terrorism as authoritarian states if they do not make sure to respect and include all of their constituents in decision making.